The bronze sky over the Troad splits with a sound like tearing linen as 1,000 ashwood spears arc upward, their leaf-shaped heads flashing once in the sun before they plunge like iron rain into the massed ranks below. Men scream, horses rear, the earth itself seems to shudder under the impact of shields splintering and breastplates buckling, and through the red haze of dust and blood strides a figure taller than any mortal, skin blackened with old gore, eyes burning with the dull glow of coals left too long in the ashes. The air around him reeks of horse sweat, voided bowels, and the sweet copper stink of arteries open to the morning light. This is no noble champion, no radiant Apollo or wise-eyed Athene. This is Ares, delighting in the slaughter, and every heart that still beats on that field knows, with the cold certainty of a spear point pressed to the throat, that the god of war has come in person to drink their terror. The Greeks did not merely dislike Ares. They loathed him with a depth that borders on religious horror. Where Zeus commanded awe, Poseidon dread, and even Hades a grim respect, Ares inspired pure revulsion. Homer never misses a chance to sneer at him. The bane of mortals, the sacker of cities, the blood-stained, the manslaying. Hesiod calls him cruel, overwhelming, sheer destruction wearing a man's shape. In the Iliad, Zeus himself, his own father, spits the words that every Greek listener nodded along to. Most hateful to me art thou of all gods that hold Olympus forever with thee is strife and wars and battles. Not even Hera, who detested most of her husband's bastards, earned such open contempt from the king of gods. The Homeric hymn to Ares begs him, almost grovels, to put away thy fierce spear and give me courage instead, as though the only acceptable prayer is one that asks the war god to go somewhere else. Why this unique hatred? Because Ares embodied war stripped of every illusion, not glory, not strategy, not even righteous vengeance, but the raw, senseless, screaming slaughter that left widows rocking over corpses and children sold in foreign markets. He was the moment when discipline collapsed into panic, when the phalanx broke and men trampled their own brothers to flee. He was the reason mothers in Argos or Thebes woke sweating from nightmares of bronze. And unlike the other gods who might punish hubris or reward piety, Ares could not be bargained with, flattered, or bought off. He simply fed. Yet every monster has an origin, and Ares began, like so many catastrophes, as a baby. In the black night halls of Thrace, far beyond the civilized world the Greeks knew, Enio, she who delights in the ruin of cities, felt the pangs of labor. Some say Hera herself, desperate for a weapon against her cheating husband, begged the northern queen to bear a child by Zeus. Others whisper that Zeus took Enio by force amid the snowstorms of Mount Haemus. Either way, the infant who slid from her womb already stank of blood, for the midwife swore his first cry sounded like the clash of iron on iron. They named him Ares, the destroyer, and from his cradle he reached not for milk, but for the bronze dagger laid beside him as an offering. His nurses were not gentle nymphs, but the twin sons of the north wind, Boreas boys Calais and Zetes, who taught him to run faster than fear itself. By the time he could walk, he was wrestling wolves in the Thracian snows, and when he laughed, the pack howled with him. His childhood toys were captured Scythian helmets filled with teeth knocked from fallen warriors. Even the horses of the Bistones, those man-eating mares later tamed by Heracles, submitted to the boy god's hand. And so he grew, taller, broader, more beautiful in the terrible way a drawn sword is beautiful, until one day he descended south, trailing frost and the smell of carrion to claim his seat on Olympus. But Olympus had little warmth for him. The first great tale the bard sang of Ares is the one that scarred him forever, the Trojan War. When the princes of Achaea sailed for Ilium to recover Helen, Ares promised nothing to either side, for promises were beneath him. He simply waited, licking his lips, until the plain before Troy became a butcher's yard. On the day the fighting grew hottest, he took the Trojan side because their champion Hector burned with a fury that tasted sweet on the god's tongue. Cloaked in cloud, Ares drove the Trojans forward like wolves among sheep, and the Argives broke and ran, their shields clattering on the ground like hailstones. Achilles sulked in his tent. Agamemnon bled from a dozen wounds, and it seemed the war god would feast forever. But then, here's the twist no Greek ever tired of telling. Athene came to Diomedes, son of Tydeus, and placed in his heart a fire hotter than Ares' own. She lifted the mist from his eyes so he could see gods walking the battlefield, and she steadied his spear arm, and she whispered, "Fear not the manslayer." Diomedes, a mortal man, roared a challenge that shook the heavens. Ares laughed, delighted at the arrogance, and hurled his great bronze spear. It should have punched clean through the Argive's chest. Instead, Diomedes, guided by Athene's unseen hand, thrust first. The spearhead, ash shaft 7 cubits long, drove into the god's belly just above the girdle, tore through divine flesh that had never known pain, and burst out the back in a spray of ichor that shone like molten gold. Ares bellowed a sound no mortal throat could make, a noise that felled oxen in their traces and burst the eardrums of men, stayed away, and he fled, actually fled up through the clouds to Olympus, trailing black blood across the sky. There he threw himself at Zeus' feet, whining like a kicked hound, holding his guts in with both hands while he demanded justice. Zeus looked down at his wounded son and spoke the words every Greek child learned by heart. "Sit there and whimper, thou renegade. I hate thee most." And the gods laughed, even Hera laughed, while Paeon the physician spread pain-killing herbs on the wound that closed almost at once, because gods do not die, but they do remember humiliation. Yet Ares learned nothing from shame. Skip ahead, if you dare, for the darkest moment, but the story will not let you escape it. Years later, when the sun rose on a day that smelled of cedar smoke and desire, the war god crept into the house of Hephaestus the smith. The lame god was away at his forge on Lemnos, hammering thunderbolts for Zeus, and Aphrodite, his unhappy wife, lay alone on a bed of swan's down. Ares had watched her for centuries, the foam-born, laughter-loving goddess whose beauty made even the sea grow calm, and his lust was a different kind of battlefield. They say he took off his blood-crusted armor piece by piece, laying the greaves and breastplate on the floor like shed snakeskin, until he stood naked and terrible before her. She did not scream. She smiled the slow smile that had broken Paris' heart and welcomed the manslayer into her arms. All day and all night they lay together, while outside the world went about its business, unaware that love and war had coupled in the same bed. But Helios the sun, who sees everything, told Hephaestus and the crippled god, for once not laughing at his own misfortune, forged a net finer than spider silk yet stronger than bronze. When Ares and Aphrodite next met, the net fell, invisible, inescapable, and bound them naked and entwined for every god on Olympus to see. Poseidon, Hermes, Apollo, they came crowding to the doorway, some laughing until ichor tears ran down their cheeks, others turning away in disgust. Ares roared, strained until the muscles stood out like ship's cables on his arms, but the net only drew tighter. Only when Hephaestus, paid an insulting bride price by Poseidon to release his wife, cut the chains did Ares flee in shame to Thrace, vowing never again to let desire weaken him. Yet even then the bards noted he returned to the beds of mortal women, serving countless warlords whose only inheritance was cruelty. And just when it seemed Ares could sink no lower in the eyes of gods and men, the giants rose against Olympus. Earth herself birthed them in wrath after the Titans fell, enormous beings armored in serpent scales, wielding uprooted pines for clubs. The prophecy ran those gods alone could not defeat them. They needed a mortal champion. Heracles was found himself dragged into the war of gods once more. Ares, burning to erase the memory of his humiliations, charged first. He met a giant named Memon somewhere on the Phlegrean plain, and their duel shook mountains. The giant's club splintered, the god's shield sent him reeling, but Ares recovered, laughing the terrible laugh at curdled milk and nursing mother's breasts, and drove his spear straight through Mimon's throat so the giant's blood gushed like a black river. One after another the giants fell to Ares that day, until even the earth groaned under the weight of their corpses. For once Olympus cheered him, though the cheers were grudging, because without the manslayer the sky itself might have fallen. Other fragments cling to his name like scraps of flesh on a battlefield. There was the time the Alaudae twin giants Otis and Ephialtes, each 9 cubits tall at 9 years old, chained Ares in bronze and stuffed him into a jar for 13 months. The stepmother of the twins, Eriboea, took pity and told Hermes, who stole the jar and freed the god, gaunt, wild-eyed, stinking of his own filth, yet still dangerous. There was the rape of Alcib, daughter of Ares, by Halirhathias, son of Poseidon. Ares caught them, split the boy from crown to groin with a single stroke, and stood trial before the gods on the hill that would forever bear his name, the Areopagus. The gods acquitted him, the first murder trial in history, because a father's vengeance, even when the father is Ares, carries its own brutal justice. There was Cadmus sowing the dragon's teeth that sprang up as armed men, and Ares claiming half of them as his own, the Spartoi who founded Thebes, soaked in their creator's blood from the moment they crawled from the furrows. And there was the Amazon queen Otrira, whom Ares loved in the savage way only he could love, and by her he fathered Penthesilea, who would one day ride to Troy and die beneath Achilles' spear, her beauty wasted on the same plain where her father had once fled wounded. But here is the darkest moment you were warned about. In the wild hills of Arcadia there stood an ancient grove sacred to Ares, older than any temple, where black dogs were sacrificed at midnight and men swore oaths on blades still wet with blood. Once, in a year of endless war, the priests decided the god needed a human offering to grant victory. They chose a captive prince of the enemy, stripped him, bound him to the altar stone still warm from the day's sun. The high priest raised the double axe, and just as the blade began its descent, Ares himself appeared, not in shining armor, but as a shadow wearing a wolf's head, eyes like dying stars. The axe fell, the boy's chest opened like a red flower, and the god leaned down and drank the steaming blood directly from the wound. The priests fell on their faces, weeping with terror and triumph, because their god had come, had accepted, had promised them slaughter without end. The next day the Arcadians won a victory so complete that crows feasted for a month. No one ever spoke of the captive's name again. Across the Greek world, temples to Ares were rarer than snow in summer. Athens had one, small and grim, on the northern slope of the Acropolis, where Ephebes swore their military oaths. Thebes kept a spring called the Spring of Ares, where the dragon once guarded the waters Cadmus needed. Sparta, predictably, honored him more openly. Young men scourged themselves before his image until the altar ran red, believing pain pleased the pain giver. But most cities preferred to chain him instead of worshipping him. In Trojan they kept bronze statues of Ares bound in iron fetters so he could not walk abroad and bring war to their gates. At Tegea, the women of the city once rooted a Spartan army and afterwards dedicated the god's chains in the temple of Aphrodite, a delicious insult that Ares never forgave. His most faithful worshippers were always foreigners, the fierce Amazons on the Thermodon, the Colchians who sacrificed strangers to his image, and above all the Thracians who tattooed their bodies with scenes of slaughter and rode into battle naked save for blood dried black on their skin. To the Greeks he remained the Thracian interloper, the barbarian among gods, the one whose altars smoked only when armies marched. They called him Enyalios when they needed courage, Gynekothoinos, the woman feaster, when they remembered what he truly loved, and Myophonios, the bloodstained, when they dared speak the truth. And so, we come to the end of blood. Ares never changed. He never learned mercy, never sought wisdom, never laid down his spear. He is the scream in the night when steel finds flesh, the moment when the shield wall breaks and civilized men become beasts again. Every battlefield since Troy has carried his footprints, every widow's wail has been music to him. Every treaty signed in hope has been a joke he laughs at from the smoke. The Greeks feared him because they saw in him the truth they spent their lives denying, that war is not noble, not heroic, not a path to undying fame, but a hungry god who eats sons and shits out sorrow. Yet they also knew, in the secret part of the soul that loves the clash of bronze on bronze, that without Ares there is no courage, no glory, no story worth singing around the fire. We bind him with laws, we chain him with treaties, we dress him in uniforms and call him duty, but he is always there, waiting for the moment the chains snap. Perhaps that is why every generation still tells his story, not to honor him, but to remind ourselves what lives inside us when the singing stops and the screaming starts. If these unflinching tales dragged from the ashes of the Bronze Age speak to you, consider subscribing to Ancient Epics so we can keep hauling more monsters into the light. Thanks for watching.